The morning began with a cold that bit through cloth and skin alike, the kind of chill that made every breath look like a confession rising into the air. Frost clung to fence rails and the brittle grasses around the ranch, catching the early light in thin, trembling lines. Somewhere beyond the main barn, a faint, uneven sound broke the stillness. Half breath, half whimper, but no one seemed willing to turn toward it. The workers moved with the tired certainty of men convinced nothing new ever happened here, shuffling toward the day's chores with shoulders hunched and eyes dulled by routine. Mara walked alongside her father, her boots a size too large, thumping against the dirt in an unsteady rhythm. She kept her hands tucked into the sleeves of her patched coat, hiding the rawness of skin split by winter. At 9 years old, she was small, quiet, and always watching the world with a seriousness that didn't quite fit her age. Her father, Daniel, carried a toolbox that had seen better years, the metal handle wrapped in a strip of old leather to keep it from cutting into his palm. He had been working on this ranch long enough to know which days would be difficult, and this one already felt heavier than most. The foreman's voice cut through the air as he barked orders about stalled machinery and a delayed shipment of feed, his tone flat, impatient, permanently unimpressed. Daniel nodded along as if absorbing every word, though he rarely bothered to speak unless directly addressed. He felt a constant pressure around his ribs, not from the cold, but from a memory he never shook. The little foal he'd tried to save the previous spring, the one that slipped away despite every hour he poured into warming, feeding, and coaxing it back to life. Failure had stayed with him, clinging like smoke on clothes. Mara heard the foreman's words, but didn't latch onto them. Her attention drifted elsewhere, tugged by an instinct she didn't question. She kept noticing that faint sound, the broken rhythm of breath she'd caught earlier. Each time the ranch hands moved, the noise seemed to answer, pausing, then returning. It felt out of place, almost hidden. She glanced at her father to see whether he reacted, but he kept walking, shoulders angled forward, gaze fixed on the tools he'd need today. 2 workers exited the barn with a folded feed sack dangling between them. Something inside shifted, lightly, almost too faintly to see. One of the men muttered, "Should have just been stillborn." The other shrugged, adjusting his grip. Neither looked down. Neither slowed. Their indifference felt colder than the wind. Mara's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with sharp curiosity. She listened again, letting the faint noise guide her. It wasn't the sound of something finished. It was the sound of something fighting. She let a few steps carry her forward, then stopped. Daniel kept walking for several paces before he realized she was no longer beside him. When he turned, she was standing absolutely still, head tilted, as if the earth were whispering to her alone. "What is it?" he asked, though he already sensed the answer would trouble him. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she walked a few feet toward the small clearing behind the barn, her boots crunching softly over frost. The workers had disappeared around the corner, the feed sack slung carelessly between them. The sound came again, thin, weak, almost swallowed by the cold, but unmistakably alive. Daniel exhaled hard. He knew that sound. He knew it like he knew his own name. Something inside him tightened. He didn't want to follow her, yet he did, because he could not bear the thought of her uncovering something that would reopen every wound he had tried to quiet. She stopped near the old equipment shed, the one that stored splintered boards and retired fence posts. She crouched, placing her hand on the cold ground, listening the way others might pray. A few more steps brought her to the discarded sack. The workers had left it near the tree line, intending to drag it farther later, or perhaps simply forgetting it. The fabric twitched faintly. Mara reached out, but her hesitation wasn't fear. It was reverence, as though she sensed the weight carried inside. Daniel arrived beside her and felt the world tilt slightly. Not again, he thought. Not this. He wanted to walk away, to pull her back, to tell her some things were best left untouched, because caring came with a cost he'd paid too many times. But Mara didn't wait for permission. She unknotted the top of the sack with small, determined fingers. When she peeled it open, a newborn foal lay inside, limp except for a slight tremor running through its flank. Its coat, still matted from birth, had the ashen hue of damp clay. Its breaths were shallow, uncertain, more suggestion than certainty. Mara brushed the edge of her sleeve across its nostrils, clearing mucus with a gentleness that made Daniel's throat tighten. She whispered nothing, yet the silence around her felt like a promise. The foal blinked once, a slow, heavy movement, and its cloudy eye met hers as if recognizing the first person who had truly seen it. Daniel knelt, though his knees protested the cold ground. He reached out, hovering his hand over the foal without touching it. He recognized the signs: low temperature, weak pulse, dehydration, shock. The ranch had likely given up the moment complications appeared during birth. Efficiency mattered more than compassion here. He hated that he understood their reasoning. He hated even more that he had accepted it for so long. Mara looked at him with a steady urgency. "He's trying," she said, voice barely above a breath. Those two words hit harder than any accusation. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He wanted to tell her that survival wasn't always possible, that some beginnings were too fragile, that he couldn't bear watching her heart break the way his had. But she waited, trusting him in a way that felt both humbling and heavy. The foal made another faint attempt to lift its head, failing and settling into her hands instead. Daniel swallowed. He knew the foreman wouldn't tolerate them interfering. He knew the risk of being blamed for taking something deemed company property, but he also knew he couldn't walk away from a creature still choosing to breathe. He lifted the foal carefully, feeling it shiver against his chest, light as sorrow and twice as delicate. "Let's go," he said, voice quiet but certain. Mara nodded once, relief and resolve moving through her like a single breath. As they walked away from the barn, the cold wind shifted behind them, carrying the distant noise of workers unaware that something discarded had been reclaimed. Daniel felt the weight of the foal against him and the even greater weight of responsibility settling over his shoulders. But for the first time in months, he also felt a small, unfamiliar ember inside his chest, something close to purpose. And Mara, walking at his side, kept glancing up at him with a look that suggested she believed they had just stepped into a moment that would change everything, though neither of them quite knew how. Daniel carried the foal across the yard with the careful steadiness of a man holding something that could vanish if jostled. Mara walked close beside him, both hands beneath the foal's dangling foreleg as if her small palms could somehow keep its pulse from slipping. The cold bit harder as they neared the shed, the wind dragging fine threads of frost across the ground. Daniel nudged the door open with his shoulder, letting the dim interior swallow them. Dust floated in the air like thin smoke, glittering faintly in the slant of pale morning light pushing through the warped boards. He laid the foal on a folded horse blanket, the only clean one they had, smoothing it so the creature wouldn't sink into the uneven floor. The newborn's flanks rose in shallow, unsteady waves, its breaths thin as paper. Mara knelt immediately, rearranging the blanket's edge with a seriousness far older than her years, creating a soft cradle for a life barely clinging to its place in the world. The foal flickered its ears once, the movement small but unmistakably deliberate, as if acknowledging the sanctuary it had been carried into. Daniel crouched beside them, feeling the ache in his joints grow sharper under the weight of responsibility. He knew the steps required: warmth, hydration, stimulation, patience, but he also knew the margin for error was cruelly narrow. The foal's condition reminded him too clearly of the one he had lost, the one that still woke him some nights with the ghost weight of failure pressing against his ribs. But Mara didn't carry that memory. She carried only the insistence that effort mattered, that something alive deserved a chance no matter how slim. He envied the clarity of her conviction. She reached into Daniel's toolbox and pulled out the small battery lantern he kept taped together at its corners. When she switched it on, yellow light spread unevenly across the shed, warming the shadows. Daniel arranged the lantern close to the foal's body, giving it the fragile heat it desperately needed. Mara sat back on her heels, watching every breath the foal took, her eyes alert, absorbing, unblinking. She did not ask whether it would live. She did not plead with her father for reassurance. Instead, she acted with unspoken understanding that hope had to be built, not requested. Daniel prepared a mix of warm water and diluted milk replacer, stirring until it thinned to a consistency the foal might accept. When he returned to the blanket, the foal's head shifted slightly, as if sensing him. He cupped his hand behind its jaw and lifted gently. Mara steadied the body, her palms supporting the trembling ribcage. The foal attempted a weak suckle, failing the first time, then managing a faint draw on the syringe. The smallest success felt like a crack of sunlight through a winter cloud. Daniel breathed out slowly, almost not realizing he'd been holding his breath. "You see," Mara whispered. "He's trying again." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He focused on measuring each small swallow, counting them in his mind, making sure the intake didn't overwhelm the fragile system struggling to wake inside the tiny body. But he felt something shift in him, a cautious stir of belief, not strong enough yet to call confidence, but far more than resignation. The foal swallowed 3 more times before its strength faded. Daniel lowered its head onto the blanket, brushing a thumb lightly along the damp ridge between its ears. They worked for nearly an hour, rotating warm cloths, adjusting the lantern, watching for signs of improvement or collapse. Through it all, Mara barely moved except to respond to the foal's smallest instinct. She seemed to understand his rhythms intuitively, leaning in when he strained, pulling back to give space when his trembling grew more intense. Daniel found himself relying on her quiet awareness, surprised by how naturally she stepped into this role beside him. Footsteps outside snapped their attention toward the door. Daniel's breath tightened. The shed's shadowed edges seemed to stiffen around them as the foreman's voice cut across the yard, sharp and impatient, demanding to know why Daniel had abandoned his assigned tasks. Daniel's pulse quickened. He'd hoped for more time before confrontation. Mara pressed closer to the foal, shielding it automatically, her small body angled with protective instinct. The shed door swung open. The foreman stared at them, first at Daniel, then at Mara, and finally at the foal lying on the blanket. His eyes narrowed, calculating and cold in a way that stripped the air of warmth. "That's company stock," he said flatly, "and company property isn't yours to keep." Daniel rose slowly, placing himself between the foreman and the foal. "He was left for dead," he said, voice steady but firm. "You threw him out. He wasn't property then." The foreman's lip curled with irritation. "I said he was non-viable. That means he's not worth resources. Should have been finished already. And now you're interfering with ranch operations." Mara's jaw tightened. Daniel saw it from the corner of his eye. The moment her fear hardened into something quieter, sharper, rooted in the certainty that abandonment masquerading as practicality was wrong. She kept her gaze locked on the foal, refusing to look at the man who had deemed it disposable. Daniel held his ground. "He's alive," he said. "Barely, but alive. If he has a chance, we're giving it to him." The foreman stepped forward, but Daniel shifted, blocking the way. The movement was simple, calm, unthreatening, but final. A boundary settled between them like a door closing. The foreman assessed the situation, calculating consequences, weighing authority against potential trouble. Mara watched him with a steadiness that belied her size. After a long beat, the foreman exhaled sharply. "I'll deal with this later," he snapped. "But don't get the idea that you can keep him." He turned and left, boots grinding frost as he strode away. When the shed door shut behind him, Mara's shoulders loosened. Daniel knelt again, checking the foal's breathing. It had grown slightly steadier, though still too thin, too fragile. Yet each rise of its flank felt like a quiet declaration. Mara stroked the foal's damp neck with the back of her hand, her touch feather-light. "What should we call him?" she asked softly. Daniel hesitated. Naming meant commitment. Naming meant responsibility that extended beyond survival into something deeper. But Mara waited with the same quiet patience she had shown since sunrise, trusting him without pressing him. "Not yet," he said finally. "Let's see how strong he gets first." She accepted this without disappointment. She simply leaned closer, letting her warmth mix with the lantern's glow. The foal shivered again, but this time it felt like a response, not a surrender. Daniel watched them both, the fragile creature and the determined child, and realized that something irreversible had begun. This wasn't just an act of rescue. It was a line drawn, a refusal to let indifference dictate the worth of a life. And though the shed remained cold, though the risks ahead were real and growing, the space around them felt subtly changed, shaped by the simple fact that they had chosen to care. The foal's eyelids fluttered once, a brief attempt to stay awake, as if sensing the fragile safety it had found. Mara smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried its own resilience. Daniel felt the moment settle inside him with unexpected clarity. Whatever came next, they were in it together. The afternoon light thinned as clouds drifted across the sky, turning the ranch yard a muted gray, the kind of color that made everything feel suspended. Daniel spent the next hours working in the shed, rationing his attention between maintenance tasks that kept suspicion low and the fragile life hidden behind those weathered boards. Mara remained with the foal, rising only when Daniel insisted she stretch her legs or drink water. Otherwise, she held her vigil with the quiet fortitude of someone who believed patience itself could shield a creature from harm. The foal's breaths had grown marginally stronger, though still too shallow for comfort. Its coat had dried into uneven ridges, softening slightly under the warmth of the lantern. Occasionally, it attempted to shift its weight, an instinctive search for balance, but the effort exhausted it almost immediately. Each attempt left Mara whispering encouragement, her words gentle but unwavering, as though speaking directly to the will that flickered somewhere inside that trembling body. Daniel prepared another diluted milk mixture as dusk seeped into the shed. When he approached, the foal raised its head a fraction higher than before, an almost insignificant movement that nonetheless made Daniel's chest tighten with cautious hope. He fed it slowly, counting each swallow the same way he might count seconds during a storm. Mara steadied the foal, her small hands cupping its ribs, absorbing its tremors as if transferring her warmth more effectively through touch. As Daniel returned the bowl to the makeshift table, he heard soft footsteps outside. He stiffened, instinctively stepping between the foal and the door. Mara watched him, eyes widening with immediate understanding. The steps halted just beyond the threshold, followed by a low, hesitant voice. "Daniel, you in there?" It was Owen, one of the older ranch hands, a man who had worked beside Daniel for more than a decade. Owen wasn't cruel, but he was cautious, shaped by years of taking orders from people who rarely cared about the consequences. Daniel cracked the shed door open an inch, leaning into the narrow space. "Yeah," he said softly. "What do you need?" Owen rubbed his beard, glancing toward the yard. "Foreman's riled up. Claims you're hiding something. Says he'll check on you again before nightfall." His eyes shifted, catching the faint glow from the lantern inside the shed. "You'd better be careful." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I hear you." Owen hesitated, lowering his voice. "Rumor is they're planning to dispose of that foal tonight. Properly this time." His expression darkened with the kind of resigned discomfort Daniel had seen on too many faces around this ranch. "If they find him, you know what happens." Daniel didn't answer, but his silence spoke loudly enough. Owen exhaled. "Just watch yourself." He stepped back and walked away, shoulders hunched as though the cold had finally caught him. Daniel closed the door quietly and turned toward Mara. She didn't ask for explanations. She had heard enough. Her hands moved instinctively to the foal's neck, her fingers gliding gently along its coarse hair. "They want him gone," she whispered. Daniel met her gaze, seeing no fear in her expression, only determination sharpened by something deeper than childhood defiance. She wasn't holding onto the foal out of simple affection. She understood the cruelty hovering at their door and refused to accept it. "We won't let them," Daniel said, though the certainty in his voice felt heavier than any promise he'd made in years. He began packing essential supplies: extra cloths, the small lantern, the syringe, the diluted milk replacer. Mara watched him without interrupting. She knew he wasn't preparing for another hour of care. He was preparing for escape, however temporary. The shed no longer felt safe. The ranch no longer felt indifferent. It felt hostile. "Where will we take him?" Mara asked. Daniel paused. "Someplace away from here. The line cabin near the east ridge. No one uses it this time of year." It was a rough shelter, half forgotten and usually swallowed by snow and silence. But it was far enough to buy them time. The foal stirred as if sensing urgency. Daniel lifted him carefully, folding the blanket around his frail body. The creature's warmth seeped slowly into Daniel's chest, and he felt again the fragility of life pressing against him. Mara gathered the remaining supplies, tucking them into a canvas sack. When Daniel cracked the door open, the ranch yard lay quiet, the last workers heading toward their quarters as dusk clung to the horizon. He nodded to Mara, and they slipped into the cold air, moving quickly but without panic. Their footsteps left shallow impressions in the frost, temporary marks that would vanish as soon as night deepened. They took the long path behind the hay storage, avoiding the main lights. The foal shifted weakly in Daniel's arms, but he steadied it with a gentle murmur. Mara walked ahead, scouting the way with surprising alertness, her small silhouette cutting through the deepening dusk with purpose. The gate leading toward the east trail was partially open, creaking softly in the wind. Daniel nudged it wider with his boot and slipped through, closing it behind them. The ranch receded slowly behind a thin veil of rising mist, its fences and barns fading into muted shapes. Mara looked back only once before turning her full attention to the path ahead. They walked until the ranch lights disappeared entirely, replaced by the faint glow of the moon emerging from a stretch of clouds. The path grew uneven, scattered with stones and brittle grass. The cold intensified, sharpening each breath into near-crystal shards. Daniel's arms ached from supporting the foal's weight, but he refused to shift his grip. Every few minutes, Mara checked the foal's breathing, her fingers brushing lightly against its nostrils. "You're doing good," Daniel murmured to her. "You're steady." She nodded but didn't speak. Her focus was fixed on the foal, on the path, on the urgency that pushed them forward. The line cabin appeared at last, a crooked silhouette tucked against a stand of leafless trees. Its roof sagged slightly, and one of the shutters hung crooked, but it offered shelter and secrecy. Mara reached the door first and pushed it open, releasing a breath of stale, cold air. She stepped aside as Daniel carried the foal inside. The cabin was dim, lit only by moonlight spilling through the gaps in the boards. Dust clung to the old table in the corner, and the cot along the wall sagged under its own age. But the space felt quiet, protected, forgotten by the ranch's rigid routines. Daniel laid the foal on the cot and set up the lantern on the table. Its warm glow spread across the room, softening the shadows. Mara unpacked the supplies, arranging them with meticulous care. The foal lifted its head again, higher this time, and let out a thin, wavering sound, neither distress nor comfort, but something in between. It settled into the blanket with a faint sigh. Mara smiled, small and tired but unmistakably hopeful. "He's stronger," she whispered. Daniel studied her expression, realizing that the child who had walked beside him hours earlier had grown somehow, quietly, without ceremony, into someone braver, someone steadier. He felt a strange mix of pride and fear, knowing they had crossed a line that could not be undone. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the cabin walls like a warning or a blessing. He wasn't sure which. But the foal's breathing steadied, and Mara's shoulders relaxed as she reached out to rest her hand on its neck. Inside that dim cabin, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years, the sense that doing the right thing, even in secrecy, had weight enough to change everything. And the night, cold as it was, seemed ready to witness whatever came next. The night settled over the valley with a kind of tense stillness that made every sound feel sharper. Daniel rode along the ridge with a deliberate pace, keeping his eyes fixed on the faint lantern glow flickering from Evelyn's cabin. He had spent the entire day sorting through the sheriff's warnings, the rancher's half-truths, and his own growing suspicion that the trouble surrounding her wasn't random misfortune, but a deliberate tightening of a noose. The air smelled of cold dust and juniper, and each breath reminded him how little time remained before everything collapsed. He urged his horse forward, refusing to let doubt slow him. Inside her cabin, Evelyn paced between the crib and the worn table, her fingers trembling despite her effort to stay composed. The newborn slept lightly, fussing every few minutes, sensing the unease that filled the room. She kept glancing at the door, hoping Daniel would appear before the threat reached her ridge. She replayed the conversation with the rancher again and again, his veiled warnings, his claim that Daniel was stirring trouble that would land both of them in danger. She knew manipulation when she heard it, but knowing didn't quiet the dread crawling along her spine. Daniel reached the porch and dismounted without waiting for the horse to settle. Evelyn opened the door before he knocked, her face illuminated by the lantern's soft glow. He stepped inside, scanning the room with quick precision. Nothing seemed disturbed, but he trusted his instincts more than appearances. He told her about the ambush outside town, about the rifle barrel he'd recognized from the last confrontation, and about the unmistakable conclusion forming in his mind. Someone wanted her land, and they believed removing him would make her an easy target. She listened without panic, though her grip on the table tightened. She asked him why a simple widow's small ridge mattered enough for men to stalk the night. Daniel told her the truth. There was water here, a hidden spring beneath her pasture that the rancher's men had recently discovered. Controlling it would shift the balance of power across the valley. She lowered her gaze, realizing the fence trouble, the broken gate, the stranger's bold threats hadn't been random harassment. They had been testing her defenses, assuming she had none. The cabin window rattled with a sudden gust, and Daniel moved the lantern to the floor, dimming the room. He told Evelyn to pack only what she needed, not because they were running, but because he refused to leave her vulnerable here while he confronted the men gathering in the dark. She protested, insisting he shouldn't face them alone, but he reminded her of the promise he'd made the first day he repaired her fence, that he wouldn't walk away when danger came clawing. His tone wasn't heroic. It was blunt, grounded in the raw truth that running never solved anything. Evelyn wrapped the newborn in a thick blanket and placed supplies in a small satchel. Daniel checked his revolver, counting the rounds with methodical calm. The tension between fear and determination settled into something steadier as he outlined the plan. She would ride with him to the old stone outpost on the ridge, a defensible point he had used years earlier. He would return to confront the rancher's hired men before they advanced on her cabin. She tried to argue, but he silenced her with a direct honesty that left no room for debate. Protecting her wasn't optional to him. They slipped outside, keeping low. The moon cast a pale wash over the valley, revealing 3 riders approaching from the southern trail. Daniel motioned for silence, led Evelyn to the horses, and lifted her into the saddle with the baby secure in her arms. He guided them into the trees, making sure their tracks blended with the natural trail. Once he confirmed she was hidden along the ridge path, he turned back toward the cabin. Evelyn whispered his name, telling him to be careful. He gave her a faint nod, not promising safety, but acknowledging the weight of her fear. Daniel reached the clearing just as the riders dismounted. They spread out, searching for signs of movement. He stepped from his shadows with measured confidence, calling out their leader by name. The man turned, surprised but not rattled, and offered Daniel a final chance to walk away. Daniel refused, demanding they leave Evelyn's land and tell the rancher he'd miscalculated. Tension snapped across the clearing as one of the men raised his weapon. Daniel drew first, dropping him with a clean shot, then moved behind a fallen log as bullets shredded bark above his shoulders. The firefight dragged on, echoing through the valley with violent clarity. Daniel advanced with tactical patience, forcing the remaining 2 gunmen into retreat. When one tried to flank him, Daniel intercepted, tackling him to the ground and knocking the weapon from his hand. The last man fled toward the trail, but Daniel fired a warning shot that sent him scrambling back toward his horse. Daniel ordered him to deliver a message. If the rancher came again, the the fight wouldn't end with warnings. When Daniel finally returned to the ridge, exhausted and bloodied, he found Evelyn waiting near the outpost. Her relief was immediate but restrained, tempered by the sight of his bruised jaw and torn sleeve. He assured her the danger wasn't gone, but the balance had shifted. She thanked him, not with soft sentiment, but with a steady acknowledgement of the risk he'd taken. He admitted he hadn't done it out of obligation. He cared for her more deeply than he'd intended, and protecting her had become something he couldn't ignore. The newborn stirred, and Evelyn adjusted the blanket while watching Daniel with quiet clarity. She told him she didn't want a protector who vanished once the threat passed. She wanted someone who stayed, someone who understood the weight of her life and still chose to walk beside her. Daniel stepped closer, realizing she was offering something more binding than gratitude. The night around them quieted, the valley settling into a rare peace. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the future open rather than close. And for the first time since her loss, Evelyn felt safe enough to imagine one. Together, they stood on the ridge, not as a desperate widow and a wandering drifter, but as two people finally facing the world without running from it.